This is a story about methadone, the drug that turned the UK's partying scene upside down in the mid to late 2000s. A story about hysterical tabloid journalists fabricating stories, each more fantastical than the last. A process that shook Middle England to its core, but also acted as a marketing arm for the drug, causing its usage to boom. So much so that it became the drug of choice for a huge amount of sesh heads, especially between the years of 2008 and 2010. This is the story about a drug that defined a generation, changed the party scene forever, and ushered in a much loved era in UK sesh history. This is the full, unabridged, insane story of methadone.
Does that cost me a tenner? Does it get me hammered? Yeah. So, oh yeah, whack that up your nose.
Every so often a drug defines a generation. Think about the hippies in the fields in the 1960s off their heads on LSD, the coke-saturated disco dance floors of the 1970s, and of course the first generation ravers fucked on ecstasy in the 1980s and 90s. They all changed the world in their own ways, and it was no different for the children of the ecstasy generation, many of whom found that their drug of choice, briefly, was methadone.
Whew, fragrant.
To find out how this happened, we've got to go back to the early and mid 2000s. The party drug landscape back then was bleak and uninspiring.
Annual trends in average purity of drugs here. This is from the government's figures. And you can see, look at the purity of crack. I mean, my God, it went down from 70% in 2003 to 32% pure in 2010-11. Same with cocaine. Average purity of cocaine seized by the police in England and Wales dropped from over 50% in 2003 right down to 28% in the latest year. Amphetamine has always been shit. It's just always been weak. It couldn't really go any further, but it did. It managed to drop down from about 10% to 9%. You know, it didn't want to be left out.
People were looking for something new. One of these people was the underground chemist and mathematician Dr. Zee, who went on to become known as the godfather of legal highs. He describes himself as a neo-Shulginist, as in he follows the teachings and methodologies of the late, great Alexander Shulgin, the man who gifted the world ecstasy. One of the main tenets of Shulgin's work is that this idea of being a psychonaut, someone who researches drugs by testing them upon themselves. Methadone was first synthesized in 1929 as a safer alternative to MDMA in psychotherapy, but the drug was largely discarded after that. It didn't start its journey onto the dance floors of dubstep club nights or the basements of student house parties until it was rediscovered and re-synthesized by Dr. Zee in 2003.
Made some on my own. I found it to be a better alternative to, say, what was the cocaine.
Not long after that, Chinese underground chemists imitated Dr. Zee's process and started producing it in bulk via wholesalers often based in the Netherlands.
I was very happy about that, actually. I didn't mind. It achieved my main goal.
But what is methadone, or 4-methylmethcathinone, or 4-MMC? Whatever you call it, it's a stimulant drug that belongs to both the amphetamine classes and the cathinone classes. It has a similar chemical structure to the cathinone compounds that are found in the cat plant, which is native to Eastern Africa. That's a sort of a mild stimulant if you chew it. When methadone went on to become very popular in the 2000s, it got a whole range of different slang names depending on where you were based, including sort of drone, MCAT, bubble. There was loads more. Depending on where you were, people called it different things. But the tabloids and the police called it meow meow. It's nearly always snorted, but it has been in pills or mixed with drinks. In rarer cases, it could be slammed or boofed. This video is brought to you by Easy Test Kits, quick, reliable and affordable drug testing kits for all your favourite party prescriptions. They are presumptive testing kits that can give you a very good indication as to what is in your baggie. Remember, you can only make informed decisions when you've got a good idea of what you're dealing with. If you want to learn more or buy a testing kit yourself, head to the description below and use my promo code SESH for a 10% discount. Mephedrone has both empathogen and stimulant effects. People report feeling high, horny, an increased sociability or confidence. They feel alert, euphoric, open, also decreased appetite, pupil dilation, changes in body temperature regulation, and an increased heart rate. A lot of people described it as a cross between MDMA and cocaine, or MDMA, cocaine, and just normal amphetamines. But the first generation ravers often disagreed with that though, and said that they didn't think it was anything like that. But by all accounts, it got you smashed, it kept you up all night, it was cheap as hell, it stank of cat piss, but it also produced a crippling come down. Depending on various factors, including how much food you've eaten, mephedrone would take generally 15 to 45 minutes to take full effect. On a full stomach, the onset could be even slower. Another thing about mephedrone is that it's sort of like, if you snort it, it hits within like a minute or 2 minutes or something like that. But the actual peak of it is like from 30 minutes or less. So it's quite a short duration of action, but it's giving people this real euphoria.
Excitement, it makes you kind of always on a mission to do something. You know, you often find yourself on the mission to go and, you know, sing a song with your mate or something like that. So like, you just end up doing stupid shit all night. It's good fun.
It's very moreish, because MDMA is less moreish because it lasts longer. But that means people did find it really moreish, and some people were sort of like more compulsively redosing and things like that.
The devil's dandruff, I call it. It's evil, man. I mean, Leeds kind of never really got out of the MCAT stage. There's still a lot of people who were bad on that and staying up for 4 or 5 days, getting sleep deprivation.
By 2007, mephedrone was being sold by various vendors quite widely online. And this is one of the reasons why it was a real pioneering drug, because this was the embryonic stages of the global online drug market that we all know today, that is vastly becoming the most dominant way of people buying drugs. It then started to get bigger and bigger, going to wider clubbing scenes, student halls, pre-drinks, and eventually all clubs, all pubs, bars and house parties had mephedrone. In June 2008, the Cambodian authorities, along with the Australian authorities, seized and destroyed 33 tons of safrole, a key precursor for MDMA. That was enough to produce 245 million ecstasy pills, and the seizure had massive implications for the global drug market. That meant that the purity of ecstasy sold around that time had plummeted in the UK from around 60% to 22%. This was compounded by the 2008 financial crash in the UK.
Britain's big banks under sustained attack on the markets. As we go on air, there are crisis talks about how to stabilise the banking system.
People were skint, they needed drugs, the drugs that are available were shit, and mephedrone filled that gap. I remember before this happened, the ecstasy pills were so shit in the UK that the general price for an ecstasy pill was so low that if people were buying in bulk like 1,000 or more, they were getting them for like 60p each, and they would generally be sold for either 3 for a tenner or 5 for a tenner, depending on the context, whether it was in a club or not, and things like that. That's how cheap the ecstasy was. It was such low quality and contained barely any MDMA at all. People would take 5, 6, 7 in one night. In 2010, almost all the ecstasy seized in the UK contained no MDMA at all, but mephedrone was being sold in every city and every town. Price was as cheap as chips, as little as £3 a gram bought online. The high lasted all night, and it was perfectly legal. All the vendors who were selling mephedrone at the time had to label it plant food and not for human consumption. And that was to create a legal loophole for them to be able to sell it and get around the Medicines Act. But that was really bad actually, because what you had was a powerful stimulant, but the vendors couldn't give any harm reduction advice whatsoever, because they had to pretend that it's not being sold for that purpose.
We stopped research chemicals.
So, could I please buy some, do you have any Go-Gain?
We stopped Go-Gain, yeah.
Yep, and some Poke.
We do stock Poke Extreme, I suppose.
Okay, a couple of packets, please, yeah. Did you notice how these research chemicals have names that make them sound like hard drugs? Right, let's have a look. Now, both of them say not approved for human consumption.
That's correct.
It says toxic symptoms may include nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, sweating, restlessness, panic, headache. I mean, it goes on and on and on.
Yeah, that's if you're supposed to consume them. So
to be honest, the person who's making this thinks that someone's going to take it, don't they? To put all of that on the back?
It's just a hazard warning label. Like anything, if you bleach, it says it on the back of bleach.
Right, how much for these then?
They're £25 a packet.
£25 a packet to go and do some chemical research at home. What kind of chemistry experiment would you recommend I did with these?
By heating it, by adding water to it. There's so many different that's just 2 chemical sort of procedures you can do on their own.
What surprised me about it was that there was a certain amount of people that wouldn't take an illegal drug, but they go to university and this is a legal drug. So they thought, oh, this is perfectly safe. And I think those are the people that struggled with it a bit more because, you know, the people that had experimented with drugs before they got to university had basically knew more about the dangers, etc. of drugs.
I know what I'll do. I'll try it on with a knife.
Since deciding to give up MCAT, this is the longest Holly's been clean.
This is probably the first 2 weeks in months that I've not touched it, and just having that 2-week break, I couldn't think of anything worse than doing it.
By April 2010, the drug was the 4th most popular amongst British clubbers. People were hoofing lines off any surface available. Methadone season was in full swing. In the 2010 Global Drug Survey, 2,220 Mixmag readers were asked about their drug use. The data was collected the year before, so this was the 2009 data. Out of the respondents who had previously used cocaine and methadone, most users, 54.6%, found that methadone produced a better quality and longer lasting high than the cocaine and was less addictive. But it's useful to point out that the quality of the coke at the time was absolute dog shit, and since then the coke quality in the UK has gone up. One study in Manchester found that half of the student population had tried methadone. The researchers said, quote, the structure of university halls, close-knit warrens of unpoliced corridors filled with young adults with student loans to burn, allowed for the seamless takeover of methadone in British universities. The media absolutely loved methadone, so much so that they would publish several stories about it every day. Many of the stories were complete nonsense, but they ran them anyway. They said that children as young as 11 were on the drug. They said that 180 children in one school took methadone and went off sick. But it later turned out that this wasn't true. Another journalist contacted the local council. They said it wasn't true. Then they said that methadone caused one person in Durham to rip out their balls. And again, Max Daly, the journalist who writes a lot about drugs, contacted Durham Council, and they said that no teenagers from Durham or anywhere else had attempted to rip out their own scrotums whilst on the drug. So it turned out it wasn't true, and eventually it was established that story came from a joke on an online message board called methadone.com, but it still ended up on the Sun newspaper on the front cover as fact.
And the stories over methadone made me tear off my scrotum. Which was one of their stories, and we did write to them and say, could you give us that case report please so we could verify it, and they refused because of course it was made up.
The tabloids reported that a death in 2009 in November was caused by methadone, but the later report from the coroner concluded that the woman had died from natural causes. And the straw that broke the camel's back with all these media stories came in March 2010, and that's when there was a tragic death of 2 teenagers in Scunthorpe. The media claimed that these deaths were from methadone and plastered it all over the front pages. Again, Eventually, the toxicology reports came back and found that it wasn't methadone that these teenagers had taken. They'd actually taken methadone. Basically, they'd been drinking all night. There might have been a miscommunication with the dealer between methadone and methadone, two very different drugs. One's a stimulant, one's a central nervous system depressant. And they took the methadone and tragically died. But it had nothing to do with methadone, but that was the story. The Sun started a campaign to get methadone banned, and eventually the government started panicking. Desperate for approval from the Sun before the general election, the Labour government banned methadone against the advice of several scientists.
Head shops closed down, sales in the back street, deaths go up. So it'll probably cause more deaths than it saves.
Several members of the Advisory Council of the Misuse of Drugs resigned in protest at what they described as an obvious knee-jerk reaction to the tabloid reporting. However, in the years following this legal change, the popularity of methadone continued to skyrocket, as did its price. It wasn't banned in China, so they kept pumping it out on an industrial level, and many dealers stockpiled the drug just before the ban when the Sun started complaining about it, knowing that it was probably going to be prohibited. Professor Fiona Measham, a criminologist and founder of the Loop drug checking charity, said the reporting of the unconfirmed deaths by the newspapers followed, quote, the usual cycle of exaggeration, distortion, inaccuracy and sensationalism associated with the reporting of drugs. According to Professor David Nutt, writing in the British Journal of Clinical Pharmacology in 2020, the methadone ban in 2010 went ahead despite any confirmed reported deaths and despite virtually no knowledge of its pharmacology and toxicology. Not only that, but the ban itself backfired. Quote, it soon transpired that banning it was associated with an increase in harms from other stimulant drugs. Because methadone was legal, it took a lot of the cocaine and amphetamine markets. This led to a remarkable fall in deaths from these two more toxic stimulants. Overall, the emergence of methadone was associated with a reduction in over 300 deaths from these other two stimulants. Since this was not a controlled trial, it is not possible to be certain that the rise of methadone use led directly to the fall in deaths from the other stimulants, but it seemed almost certain to have been a significant factor. In hindsight, one could speculate that methadone turned out to be the most effective intervention to reduce cocaine deaths ever known. Further evidence for a causative effect of methadone is in the fact that since it was banned, cocaine deaths have risen to their highest ever levels. Dr. Zee circumnavigated the ban in spectacular fashion by making more and more substances, tweaking a molecule here and there, like an artist working on their latest masterpiece. He eventually ended up with a portfolio of compounds, second-generation legal highs, many of which shared structural and functional similarities to methadone. As soon as the British government banned a new analogue of methadone, bang! Dr. Zee's new creation would immediately pop up like a chemical jack-in-the-box.
So we change a little bit here, change a little bit there, and then you make them.
A couple of years after the ban, methadone's popularity did start to wane. It became less and less popular as the quality of MDMA and cocaine increased. The reason it got so popular in the first place was because it created the perfect storm. It was cheap, pure, legal, and readily available at a time when the traditional drugs weren't readily available. It was mainly the media feeding on the story like a pack of hungry hyenas that caused the popularity. They were advertising the drug. They did it to sell papers and get clicks on their websites, but it also served as a huge marketing campaign for methadone. In a 2015 interview with Drug Reporter, Dr. Zee described this as free advertising for him.
When you warn about a drug, you make it very, very popular.
Facing an alphabet soup of new chemicals flooding the market over the next few years, the British government introduced the Psychoactive Substances Act in 2016, a Home Office bill banning any substance with a psychoactive element which, quote, stimulates or depresses a person's central nervous system or affects that person's mental functioning or emotional state. meaning the list of banned substances is potentially open-ended.
From today, so-called legal highs are illegal to purchase in Britain, with sellers now facing up to 7 years behind bars. The Psychoactive Substances Act has already been met with criticism that it won't deter users and will drive dealers underground.
This is another reason that methadone was such a seminal drug. It kick-started that process which resulted in the Psychoactive Substances Act, an act that the former Chief Government Drug Advisor David Nutt said was, quote, arguably the worst piece of legislation in living memory.
It's a very draconian piece of legislation. In fact, it's the most bizarre piece of legislation for centuries.
The year before the Psychoactive Substances Act, the Irish courts wanted to enact something similar, but they actually messed up the process, meaning that their 1977 Misuse of Drugs Act was found unconstitutional by the Court of Appeal. As a result, they accidentally legalised 100 drugs, including ecstasy, crystal meth and ket. It was all legal for 24 hours in Ireland. Methadone continued to be popular in the queer chemsex subculture due to its ability to make someone horny as fuck. Methadone, crystal meth, known as Tina, and Viagra is the chemsex special order. It's still popular in that context now. Caffeinones did touch the mainstream in the UK once again for a brief moment after the pandemic. That was when the lockdowns and Brexit had disrupted road haulage, which messed up the MDMA market in the UK at the time. For one summer in 2021, many of the ecstasy pills that were sold in the UK actually contained caffeinones instead. Research from the time showed that 45% of ecstasy pills tested at one British music festival actually contained synthetic caffeinones instead of MDMA. But the following year, high quality MDMA was back on the menu and caffeinones retreated back to fringe subcultures involving specific clubbing tribes. Dr. Z's caffeinone creations, methadone, 3-MMC, 3-CMC, 4-CMC and so on and so forth have enjoyed a renaissance in the past few years in the UK. But it is a long way from the lofty heights of its 2008 to 2010 heyday. The big comeback, however, has occurred elsewhere in Europe. According to research from the UN, by 2022, there was 183 unique synthetic caffeinones that were reported being used in 41 European countries. The European Monitoring Centre for Drugs and Drug Addiction released research that year, and they said, quote, there had been a marked increase in the supply of caffeinone powders in Europe. Originally, the overwhelming majority of caffeinones were manufactured in China, but they eventually banned the substance. Following this, the manufacturing largely moved over to India and was imported into Europe on an industrial scale. On top of that, you have smaller domestic operations popping off inside Europe too, including in the Netherlands. What can we learn from this? Well, it really sort of cements the idea that drug policy in the UK is not based on rational science or any sort of evidence of harms or anything like that. It's actually based on this weird sort of game of ping pong between media tabloid journalists, career politicians trying to sort of escalate their interests, and the general public. But in this case, that game of ping pong was definitely won by the tabloid media.